I can't help but ask myself if Dune 2021 would have been better if it would have been directed by James Cameron. Now, before you lose your mind, you pull your hair out and you declare jihad against me, allow me to explain. This is not something that I feel I want. This is something that I'm just questioning in regards to the overall dialogue and relative disconnect surrounding the movie. It came out last week, it came out last month to very good reviews when it dropped overseas, made a lot of money overseas, but when it came to the United States, when it came to streaming on HBO Max and it came to playing in theaters, especially large format presentations like IMAX, the movie has been relative hit or miss with a lot of people. And I've been really racking my brain over this entire thing since I saw the movie myself, because I wanted to refrain from judgment, obviously, until I sat down to watch part one of this very long and very interesting series that the best way I can describe it is that it's basically dry toast science fiction. It is very dry. The fact that it takes place on a desert planet is very apt and in tune with the type of writing that Frank Herbert did. The series, while interesting and fascinating and definitely worth discussing and diving into, is still dry as hell. And I'm wondering if that kind of hard sci-fi doesn't have much of a place in the discourse of today's environment. Now, the movie has done actually better than expected. So I am not sitting there and attempting to say that this film is a failure by any stretch of the imagination. Obviously, with the pandemic and the delay, things like this took a bit of time to get going. What I'm referring to here is the conversation surrounding it, especially on social media. It is just kind of wild in many instances what people are saying in regards to Dune. You have one group of people that are absolutely in awe of what the director was able to accomplish. They're absolutely in utter shock with the scope and size and scale of this project, and they are desperately awaiting part two, which is obviously on the horizon and will be coming, I believe, in the fall of 2023. However, it did come out today that the movie will not even begin filming until fall 2022 at the very earliest. Now, of course, there's an entire discussion to be had about whether or not they should have filmed Dune Part 1 and Part 2 back to back. The director has said that he prefers to not have done that because he would rather be able to take a bit of a break, recharge his batteries, come back in order to really kind of knock it out of the park. But at the same time, given how we do treat these types of franchises these days, a 2-year break in between movies, especially one of this nature, might ultimately be not the best. And I say this by also trying to use the 2017 and 2019 It adaptations, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The reason why I say this is because the hype and the impact that came off of It Chapter 1 was insane. It was immense. It put Andy Muschietti on the board, if you will, and it brought out the hype and desire for Part 2 to drop instantaneously. People wanted to see the conclusion to that story. They wanted to see it pick up, 30 years later. And obviously it took a little bit of time to get the movie made, and it came out in the fall of 2019. And while It Chapter 2 was great, it definitely didn't have the hype surrounding it because so much time had passed. And that is actually a real issue. It's one that even I, as a longtime movie fan, maybe feel like we are at a point where it's that kind of hype and that kind of needing instant gratification is definitely going to be hurting some of these projects rather than not. And I mentioned, James Cameron at the beginning of this and how he would have approached Dune, but I also think a bit about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and how they're able to crank out 2, 3, 4 movies a year, now multiple television shows a year, and for the foreseeable future, how the whole thing is planned out in advance, how it's planned out years ahead of time, and how they have all their ducks in a row, and it's a finely oiled, well-tuned machine that is just churning out the money. And it seems like no one else can even remotely keep up with this. When you think about something like Dune is a property that has been around since the mid-1960s. Obviously, you had the mid-1980s adaptation by David Lynch, one that is both praised and hated by many different people for many different reasons. Some love the way that he was able to wrap up the whole first book in 2 hours and 16 minutes. Others hate the way that he was able to wrap up the story in 2 hours and 16 minutes, complete with a very campy representation of some of those characters. It is very interesting to talk about the discourse of Dune, because while I personally enjoyed the slower paced, methodical storytelling to the movie, I think people out there who are upset with it wanted it to either be longer to go further into the details, into the weeds in regards to the lore and to the characters, and to really explain some motivation and some character development. So they would argue that a television show would be better. And in many instances, the Sci-Fi Channel one that came out in 2000 starring William Hurt would probably be the one that's best made for them. Even though the effects aren't the greatest, there were some decent actors in that, and it definitely was one that has lived on in popularity. This one, though, again, is a much different situation entirely. You are not going to be able to get that kind of nuance, character development, and pacing and length, I should say, in a feature-length movie. Not in today's world. The fact that we got 2.5 hours for what we got was insane. The fact that there's no director's cut is even insaner coming out of Warner Brothers, but I digress on that one. What I mean here is that Denis, whose last name I can never pronounce, I'm not even going to try, he wanted to tell this story in the way he wanted to tell it. He needed to get to the meat of the story, explain the characters, explain the world, explain the setup, and then go from there. Part 1 was simply a setup for part 2. And I think that's the problem. I think it's the problem because when people went to go see it over the course of this last weekend and even last month overseas, part 2 was not a guarantee. I think deep down we all knew that part 2 was probably going to be happening, but at the same time, it was still not a guarantee. That is going to impact people when they watch something. If you tell someone that there is something on the horizon to look forward to, they will then get excited. If they are unable to know about that, or they don't think that them investing is going to, yield any results, then they're not going to care as much. This is one of the problems with these kind of stories. Studios need to look at them the same way Marvel does. Lay everything out years in advance, plot it all, and invest the damn money. Don't wait for the box office returns to come in. Don't wait for the Palme d'Or from, the Venice International Film Festival to come on in, or whatever it is you're trying to go for. Screw all that. Go after the money, but plan it out and play the long game. We are in an age now where this needs to happen, which is why I go back to the James Cameron approach. I think if James Cameron would have directed Dune, it would have been hailed as well as this one was, but the normies and the hardcore fans would have been happy. It would have pushed technological boundaries outside of slow, methodical storytelling, and it would have been accessible enough for each and every person to dive into. Now, herein lies the problem with this, by the way, is would James Cameron be able to touch upon the nuance of what Frank Herbert was attempting to say with his book? Would he be able to tap into the core storyline and really explain what it's all about, leading the audience to the ultimate conclusion that Frank Herbert had about, more or less the white savior trope and how, hey, this is bad. Don't do it. That's kind of what it leads to, if I recall correctly. I could be wrong, and I'm sure somebody will correct me on that front. What I mean by that is a lot of people who have watched Dune simply don't understand it. And under a different director, would they have gotten it in a way to where he would have set it up and laid it out in a way that was more manageable and more consumable by average audience goers? And therein is the situation. Because when you have a property like this, one that is dry and that is dense and that is very in-depth, it requires a bit of alteration in order to be able to create an apt adaptation. And that is something that not a lot of people can do. Now, the reason why I say someone like Cameron over someone like, let's say, Kevin Feige and the Russo bros at Marvel has everything to do with the approach. Marvel would homogenize everything. They would plan out all the books. They'd have them all ready to go. Dune Part 1, Dune Part 2, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, and whatever the hell else is coming down the pipeline. They'd have it all ready to go. but they would have that ready to go at the sake of certain levels of creativity and certain levels of storytelling in order to move the plot from point A to point B while still giving the audience something to be able to dive into, whether it's action, excitement, or anything that would be popcorn worthy. And then from there, they would then establish a episode of the week type scenario, which is funny when I say it like that, because when people say that they want this to be a television series, all things considered, Marvel would treat it like a television series and you would get what you want at the end. But there might be a couple sacrifices in regards to the way, the aesthetic that the story is told. That is the disconnect with this tale. It's very fascinating when you look at it from that perspective of what the hardcore science fiction fans want, who have grown up reading this tale, versus those who are like me, who have only seen the 1980s movie and the 2021 movie. And I played the video game, which I really liked. I thought it was a lot of fun. I like the RTS. Or maybe I should go play that again. I do need to watch the 2000 miniseries and probably should read the book, but again, it's hard these days to find the time to do that kind of stuff and to really invest into understanding everything Herbert was laying down. Because I'll fully admit, I skimmed through the Wikipedia. Man, some of that stuff gets a little bit complicated to understand. There's some birth control and there's other stuff going on, and there's like, religious wars and shit. I'm like, all right, I'll have to check it out eventually. Hopefully through Denis Villeneuve in his movies. But anyway, I just wanted to talk about that real quick. I want to give my thoughts about this Dune disconnect, as I'm calling it. Let me hear your thoughts. Let me hear your opinions. I appreciate everybody tuning on in. I'll talk to you guys all later. Have yourself a great night. Thank you again.